welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that this week is unsupervised, unleashed. We are without Ben today.
Unprepared.
We are completely winging it. Like, we were meant to start recording half an hour ago, and we've both just been sat here going like, yeah, I'm just going to look at this quick. So hopefully that doesn't reflect too poorly on us and doesn't make for a terrible episode. We will see. As you can tell, I am joined this week by the Reverend and Right Honourable Jonny Bell MP.
Yes. Hello.
I think I had control of the soundboard after in the last episode as well, and I have control of it again today, so you're all in for it. How are you doing, Jonny? How's your constituency in... where's your constituency again?
North Norfolk. Very, very Tory and blue. Just like my hair. I mean, surely it can't be a coincidence, you know. I do remember when I was doing my undergrad, and it was the general election where the Lib Dems did the coalition. Ugh. And people asked me who I voted for, and I would just jokingly go, oh, what's the colour of my hair? And people wouldn't know whether I was joking or not.
Was your hair blue back then as well?
Oh, it's been blue for about 18 years.
Wow. There we go. You are the epitome of the metropolitan liberal elite, aren't you, with your blue hair?
Yeah, absolutely.
I did hear someone the other day, I can't even remember who it was, it's some sort of right-wing figure, literally slagging off people with blue hair for being the metropolitan liberal elite.
I mean, being liberal's a bit insulting.
Today, we're going to talk about the election and like sort of various Christian responses to it. Our favourite topic on this podcast, the Church of England. And in fact, they haven't just had one response to it. They've got a few, but obviously there's a few different official ones as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, why don't we start with a little bit of what else is on my mind, Grapes?
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
Jonny, do you want to kick us off? I believe Pope Francis has been in the news.
Oh, yeah. Saying some delightful things about people like me.
Again.
Using a word that, using a word that he apologised previously for, saying the Vatican's got a bit of fagginess in it or something like that, you know.
Sounds hot.
It does. I mean, if it's anything like the Church of England, of course it does, and probably more so.
You cannot prance around in lace dresses wearing all sorts of gold finery without there being a little bit of that in the church, I'm afraid. So
absolutely.
They're gonna have to get used to that, I think.
Indeed. It kind of shows that the desire to not be discriminatory is actually like very surface level and more about show than anything else.
Well, look, I mean, he's still the Pope, isn't he? Like, let's face it, everyone loves him, but he's still the Pope, you know, and like he's done a lot of and said a lot of things at this point that are at the very least deeply questionable. And it's like, just because like you're not as bad as Ratzinger doesn't mean like you ain't got some serious issues there. I mean, Ratzinger was basically, I mean, he not only did he look like Palpatine, he basically was Palpatine, wasn't he?
Let the hate flow through you.
Basically. And having that as the bar is pretty...
Yeah, it's a low bar to get over. So there we go. So Pope Francis, trash or pass?
Pass.
What?
Technically.
Hello, everyone. Adam here in the editing booth. Look, I know it's smash or pass, not trash or pass. Don't at me. I would delete it, but it's actually going to be quite a big thing in this episode. So if you could just humour me for the rest of this one, I'd really appreciate it. On top of that, let's talk about an article that you sent through. It's not an article, actually, although there are articles associated with it, from our good friends at Christian Concern.
Gotta love them.
Oh, my goodness. They are the gift that keeps giving, aren't they? What have they been doing, Jonny?
Oh, there's a new petition going around saying stop divisive progress pride flag displays. Each June, our neighbourhoods are swamped with pride flags as councils, shops and other businesses signal their support for LGBTQ plus ideology. Oh. It's time to stop this. And it goes on in that vein. And it says, and there are many good reasons not to allow these displays. They send the message that Christians, and others with historic beliefs about sexuality and gender are not welcome. They even cause division amongst the groups they claim to represent, many of whom are concerned about gender ideology.
I'd love to see a percentage for that, by the way. I'd love to see it.
Absolutely.
Because these LGB groups exist, but they are a pretty hated minority. It's not to say there aren't general, broader issues within the LGBTQ plus movement, I'm sure. We're all human.
And the third bullet point really takes it home, and actually I think they have a real point with it. They are particularly ugly and not in keeping with the historic character of central London.
No, I'm sorry. Hang on. Okay. I think there's a weird irony about a conservative, mostly evangelical Christian group criticizing gays for having something ugly. I don't think that's really congruous with those two movements.
You mean to say that the way they think isn't congruous? I'm shocked, Adam. I'm shocked.
Shocked and appalled.
But no, you can really tell that they're grasping at straws for here, or clutching at straws, whatever the idiom is. But yeah, like they're having to say, but it looks bad. And it's pathetic. And I find it hilarious. And they also talk about it representing trans people as well in the new flags and this whole gender ideology shit.
There is one good thing about this, though, and it's that I've learnt that the councillor that they are sending this petition to is called Adam Hugg, which I think is a delightful name.
Yes.
And apparently he is authorising large-scale displays of Pride Progress flags in Westminster. And I think, Adam Hugg, he deserves all the hugs he can get. Good effort. I don't know anything about him. He could be awful in every other way. I don't know. But in this case, well, are we going to give this trash a pass?
Oh, fucking trash it. Burn it.
Let's move on to our final thing in the Mind Grapes section. We are going to talk about an article that came out, was it yesterday? Or today, in fact. Today. In the Church Times. It's
hot off the press,
called Future of Established Church Debated at Pusey House Conference. So there was apparently a conference in which various things were debated, and one of those things was the potential disestablishment of the Church of England.
And don't forget, in quotes, the complete ignorance of the most basic fundamentals of biblical stories, end quote, among children, which is, the phrasing's beautiful.
I think in the society that we're in, it can be helpful if children sort of know this stuff, but I don't think it's a massive moral failing that children don't know basic biblical stories. I'd like it if they did, but the thing is, most adults, even if they have a basic knowledge of particular biblical stories, often kind of fundamentally misunderstand them. And I include people in the church in this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, to me, the one that always seems crazy, actually, and this is something a lot of people have said many times, but it's that we teach the Noah and the Ark kind of, the flood kind of story, as if it is a children's story. And I can never quite get around that, because it's such a surface level reading. We all do it. The church does it. The church has all these little play things with the ark and the animals on it, because of course they do. And then we try and reframe this as like God's love for humanity. I'm like, hang on a minute. People did something bad, so God killed them all.
People didn't do anything bad. It was the Nephilim who basically took women.
Right,
so it wasn't humanity.
Basic misunderstanding,
Yeah.
But this is the point. We teach this story in a way that nobody understands to children, as if it's a nice story about the fluffy animals getting all in a boat and stuff, and not about
God committing genocide.
Right, yeah. And obviously, shock horror, the flood didn't happen. But the fact is, this is received tradition that we consistently misunderstand and teach to our children as if it's a story of God's grace toward humanity, and it's not.
And just as an aside, Genesis is the book in Bible Month, and I've been exploring it with a couple of my churches. And we did Noah last week, and I've been talking to them about documentary hypothesis that the Hebrew Bible's made up into different time periods and things. And last week we looked at the Yahwist part of the Noah story and the priestly part of the Noah story. And that's what led on to a discussion about power, because I sort of spoke about the priestly tradition being more about the cult being in power and it being more of a theocracy. And one person said, yeah, actually, the priestly source, you can really see it's about power. You're putting in more detail and making it seem, like this is how it happened exactly. And then it led on to a conversation about Marx, about power, about disestablishing the church, and great stuff. Yeah, I didn't have to initiate that at all. It was wonderful.
Which, when we actually use the tools that we have, modern biblical criticism, that kind of thing, to talk about this stuff and think about this stuff, we can end up having these interesting conversations, and we can end up working out and working through ways of seeing this that sort of reveal something to us. I'm obviously be careful about the language I use here about revealing knowledge or whatever, but can help us think about these things in ways that we're not normally encouraged to think about them. The big thing in this article was about the potential for the Church of England to be disestablished. Now, we've mentioned on the podcast before the framing of this, because so often the framing of this, and in this case, the framing of this is basically the church is tearing itself apart and kind of doesn't want to have same-sex marriage in the church, and society is looking in from the outside, just being like, what? What's wrong with you? And the church, as usual, refuses. It's not even, the thing is, people frame this as like the church not wanting to catch up with society, which is something that's mentioned in this article. The thing is, I think it's about the church not wanting to catch up with the gospel. How long are we going to treat LGBTQ plus people like shit and expect that to be considered good news? That's the thing I can't understand. The fruit of this stuff is so universally toxic. It's such bad fruit that, to me, that's a pretty good sign that it's long, long since time that we had same-sex marriage. What's frustrating is that it's not wanting to give the most basic rights to LGBTQ plus people that may mean that we end up with disestablishment of the Church of England, which is a good thing. So it's weird.
Yeah. And I mean, it always comes back to power. It's about holding on to power as much as possible and not wanting to lose that.
Exactly.
That's why they're so scared of things fracturing. But I also want to say that having same-sex marriage is basically straight people saying, oh, you've got same-sex marriage now, you're equal. And almost thinking, oh, that's what the problem is. And it just completely misses the point. And like this, it misses the point of what they're trying to do. They're trying to hold on to power. They're trying to keep their positions of seniority and influence and all that stuff. But they're not realizing that that's what they're doing. They're using... It's like having a message on the front of their T-shirt saying, if we have same-sex marriage, it's going to break the church apart. Whereas the back of the T-shirt says, I don't want to lose my position on authority. And it's almost like that's done in an unconscious way and they don't even realize.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this ties in as well to, the Church of England has this idea of itself as having a duty to everyone of every faith and none in England.
Yeah.
And they tie this in with concern for the nation and the fact that one of the people in this debate talked about the fact that the king, Charles Windsor to you and I, swore a Christian oath when he became king. And this whole thing around oaths and nationhood and that kind of thing, they are arguing that ties into their duty to everyone and their duty to, have a sort of a pastoral care for everyone and the Church of England being there for everyone. But it's precisely the opposite. right? Because actually what you're doing by insisting on having these archaic, anti-democratic ways of doing things that hold up the status quo, that prop up this failing and failed system, is excluding people from the message of the gospel. The question is, what do you think the message of the gospel is? And I suspect that, we might have a different answer to that than many of the people in this debate.
Yeah, and if you do believe that your office is a sort of divine ordinance, in a sense, then parting with that would feel sacrilegious, I imagine. And it's interesting when you're dealing with belief, that can be the thing that prevents what we were talking about earlier with Christian Concern of that congruent thinking. You have all these kind of things that mismatch with each other and contradict one another, but they're still put together and said, no, they don't contradict, they work. And it's this kind of constant thing that they're trying to do. I mean, even with them saying, one of the paragraphs, it says, one reason for that was that despite running large numbers of schools, the church did not seem to be inculcating a familiarity with the Bible. And it's almost like this idea, we just need people to know what the Bible says. And it's like, but actually, if you really read the Bible, there's some wonderful parts, but there is a lot of violence. And is that what we're wanting people to learn? Actually, Abigail Thorne, in her recent series of YouTube video essays talking about phantasms, it's this prism that turns the as if into an as so, and it's just they can't get past this thing that they're trying to see the way through this prism.
Yeah, I mean, I also think this is one of the areas where, a more material understanding of the faith can be useful to us. You talk about belief being associated with this idea of phantasms and things being just so, and how that is, it's always going to be particularly relevant to an established church, isn't it? Because how could you possibly see things outside of, I'm not saying there is a single dominant narrative as such, but what I am saying is, perhaps if there is one, there might be room for maneuver within that. But as soon as you deviate from that, I mean, it's like the whole idea of the Overton window, right? The same thing exists within the church as well, in many different ways. Yeah, so I think a material understanding of the faith can really help with that, where actually we start to question, well, materially, what is this doing? And materially, what should we be doing? Because materially, the Church of England in particular, but arguably most mainstream Christianity as a whole, exists, as I mentioned before, to continue the status quo, to prop up the state, to give it legitimacy. But actually, when you look at what Jesus says, when you look at some of the epistles and you try to understand them, particularly understand them using the voice of the oppressed, through that sort of liberation theology lens, the voice of what liberation theologians would call the poor, which is a far broader category, you start to see things a bit differently. So we've seen how the Church of England is looking at the issues around establishment, disestablishment, that kind of thing, which leads us on quite nicely to talk about their approach, or approaches, I think is probably more accurate, to the upcoming election. Now, I've got something open in front of me that is talking about their new campaign known as #PrayYourPart. And I'm going to start this off by playing the audio of a video that they have put in this from the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell.
My first hope is simply that all of us vote. But I'm also thinking, when I vote, when you vote, what's going to influence our decision when we place that cross on the ballot paper? Well, as a Christian, I'm hoping and I'm praying that when I vote, when you vote, we won't be placing our vote about what's going to be best for us, but what's going to be best for God's world.
Okay, so first thing to say about this is how much Stephen Cottrell sounds like Nigel Farage.
Yes.
Can you hear it, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think they probably have quite different politics, but they really sound similar. Maybe they went... No, I think actually, to be fair, I think Stephen Cottrell is state educated, which is a rarity amongst archbishops and bishops in general, actually. But no, he really sounds like him. Which, I think they have different politics within the frame of acceptable political thought in this country, because that is very much what Nigel Farage represents. He represents the status quo with a little bit more murder. Which, given that the status quo already includes a lot of what academics would call social murder, I kind of don't think we need too much more of.
I don't know. It seems entirely proportionate, his views.
All right, let's do a trash or pass to Nigel Farage's views, shall we? Look, I'll give you a few. Proportional representation is something Nigel Farage wants. Trash or pass?
It depends what he means by that.
It means he wants fascists to have more seats in the House of Commons. Do we want that?
Of course, yeah. I mean...
No, I mean, I think this is the thing, isn't it? Apart from anything, look, I think proportional representation is probably a better thing than first past the post. However, it also, in a liberal, quote-unquote, democracy, means that it's going to lead to some unsavoury characters getting more seats.
Indeed.
Which I think is an indictment on the very idea of representative democracy in the first place. So,
indeed. And you would have to have those kind of checks and balances. It's that thing of you need to be intolerant of intolerance.
I mean, look, as I always say, representative democracy is no democracy at all. So there we go. So I'm actually going to give him a for that one. Anyway, let's move on. I don't want to talk about Nigel Farage anymore.
Yeah, we're going to go down a rabbit hole where we won't escape from.
Yeah, so. No. Don't you think though? And I don't mean this as like...
we're going back Stephen Cottrell.
I've got to say this last thing, though. And I don't mean, I'm not a big one for like saying that person is ugly or whatever. That's not what it's about. But don't you think Nigel Farage looks like Jabba the Hutt went on a diet?
I honestly haven't thought that much about it.
Honestly, have a look at Jabba the Hutt. It's the face more than anything. It's the face.
Okay, I will look at him. Yeah. The way Seb, my husband, described him is that Nigel Farage is the person who peaked at university and just hasn't gotten out of that, and is that like that awkward sort of middle-aged person that keeps going to freshers things and various student nights and whatnot, and everyone's awkward and feels that second-hand embarrassment.
I mean, yeah, but his horrible message has a lot of cut-through in particular places, and I think that's something that we don't deal with well enough. I used to live in Edinburgh, right? And Edinburgh is a really cool, hip, metropolitan kind of place. Lots of interesting...
Full of people with blue hair.
But it's a really interesting place, a really cool place. And then after Edinburgh, well, I briefly moved somewhere else in Scotland, but then after that I moved to Sunderland. And Sunderland is a sort of post-industrial, very working class place. And the challenges facing those two cities could not be more stark. There's poverty in both, right? There's a lot more poverty in Sunderland proportionately, but there is, any city is going to have poverty and issues to deal with. But one of the things is that whilst it's important to recognise that fascists would be nowhere without their middle class base, their middle class voters, because that, although people like to imagine that it is just working class people in these movements, it's not. It's very much middle class people. I mean, Donald Trump was voted for by what, in this country we would call middle class voters. They came out overwhelmingly to vote for him. But characters like that, including Nigel Farage, also have a lot of cut through in many poorer communities as well.
Well, yeah, if you're being alienated and someone appears to be offering solutions, what are you going to do? Exactly.
And the fact is, the left needs to get out of cities like Edinburgh and get into places like Sunderland and actually start doing... Because there's a lot of great things that the left do in places like Edinburgh. Food sharing programs, cooperatives, all that kind of thing. But you don't see that kind of thing in Sunderland partly because, there's no jobs in the first place for anyone to go to. But that is something that we need to work out and get a strategy around, I think. There are some wonderful left-wing people doing wonderful things in places like Sunderland. I know many of them, but it's not nearly enough compared to places like Edinburgh that I think basically a lot of it is about people want to live there because it's nice, and we need to get over that.
Yeah, and it is as someone who lives in one of the most beautiful parts of the country, it is really nice. I mean, we won't be here probably that long, but the architecture and space around you affects you psychologically.
Yeah.
And, that is something that is considered selfishly or will be considered when we come up for reappointment and stationing and stuff.
So anyway, Stephen Cotterill said something very interesting at the start of his thing there. The very first thing he said was that he hoped that everyone got out and voted. Jonny, voting, trash or pass?
Oh, pass. Yeah, big tick. But the thing is that obviously invalidated ballots are also counted.
Yeah.
Not that I would obviously ever condone that sort of illegal behaviour, but
I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine how you can do that, though. That's the problem, especially on any kind of scale. I'm going to go controversially in general, but uncontroversially amongst anarchists with voting trash.
That's really surprised me, Adam. I'm shocked.
Now, I mean, look, here's the thing. Most of the time I do vote because I might as well. For the little good it will do, I might as well. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking that it really does a lot, right? Because for it to actually accomplish anything, you'd have to deal with the forces in society, the forces of what Gramsci would call cultural hegemony, what Engels, channeling Marx, would call false consciousness, all of these things that go into getting the turkeys to vote for Christmas.
Absolutely. And it's not, as you're saying, it's not going to cause that systemic change, and it just perpetuates the system.
Particularly at the moment, I would argue. We've got two political parties that, I know it's rather cliche to say that Labour are just red Tories or whatever, but they really have sort of just become, since Blair really, but especially under Starmer, they've become what the Tories were, I think, actually in around 2010. And the Tories have become what UKIP were in around 2010, No,
absolutely. I mean, politics have just been going more and more to the right.
Yeah. And the thing is, I hear people saying to me, you have to vote for Labour, get them out. The Tories, that being. And the thing is, the answer to that is that the more we do this, the more we capitulate to Labour's bullshit, rather than voting for someone else, the more things get worse overall, right? It could be that the Tories, theoretically speaking here, the Tories end up getting back in. But if you vote for Labour when they're going further and further to the right, rather than going left or not going at all, you end up giving Labour a message that says, actually, no, we like it when you go right, so carry on. And we've seen this fairly constantly over the last 40, 50 years of politics in general shifting further and further right. Because politicians don't just respond to, what the country is doing, what people are doing, that kind of thing. They set the agenda as well. And Maggie Thatcher, she set an agenda, she set the tune, Blair danced to it, and Keir Starmer is basically raving.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Yeah, and I think the kind of socio-political literacy of people, like the average person, is a lot lower today than it was 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And that's partly because unions have been kind of crushed.
Yeah.
And there's something about criticizing capitalism illegal in schools that also hampers that socio-political literacy stuff. If you're not able to criticize the system you're in, you're not going to be able to understand it.
Yeah, and I mean, we see that more and more. Like, more and more laws are being passed to attack any ability, any way that, especially in things like schools, we have of being able to understand and break down different sources of information. I mean, we've always taught kids to love the monarchy, love the flag, all that kind of thing. It's more insidious than it is in America.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not as obvious, but it is absolutely something that we have done in schools. But it's getting worse and worse because, now teachers have to teach kids British values, which are this ridiculous list of things that you basically can't question. You're not allowed to question that.
No, indeed. They came in when I was a teacher and I was like, what is this?
Yeah.
This is ridiculous. It's full of racism and nationalism.
Yep.
What?
Yep. And then, further to that, if a student, as in a child, expresses any opinion that deviates from, again, that Overton window, that range of acceptable political opinions, regardless of whether that's left or right or what it is, you're technically required to report them to prevent.
Yes.
So if someone's saying, I'm an anarchist, which means that I believe in mutual aid and solidarity and squatting billionaires' empty properties, that kind of thing, you have to report that person to prevent. Now, realistically, the vast majority of teachers aren't going to do that because they're not that stupid.
No.
But that is what the letter of the law requires, not to mention all the Islamophobia and so on that's coded into it.
Yes.
Do we want to have a quick look at the Pray Your Part online booklet?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about actually was just at the end of what Stephen Cotterill was talking about in that 30-second clip. He sort of ended it with saying we when we're thinking about these things and praying on these things, we shouldn't be doing what's best for us, but what's best for God's world.
Great.
But you can't argue with that, and that's potentially problematic in of itself by using that to end with. Because it's like, but I'm saying it's all about God, and it's like, yeah, but what you're implying is still potentially problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing, is that, I mean, actually, when you look at the table of contents on the booklet for Pray Your Part, it goes down, and we can't see it because this is a preview, so we've only got the first 3 days. But one of them is like prisons, one of them is good government, one of them's the justice system, one of them's defence. And some of these, I'm like, if these, the readings and prayers for this are anything other than abolish prisons, essentially completely take apart the justice system and think of something entirely new. And the environment, for example, if the readings for the environment and the prayers for the environment are anything other than smash capitalism because that's what's causing the massive ecological damage.
Yes.
Right. And let's be clear, we can't see these, but they absolutely do not say that. There's absolutely no way in hell the Church of England is putting out an official document that says smash capitalism, empty the prisons, etc., etc. That's not what the Church of England is about. And I think this is the thing. This is why it goes back so much to this framing that you're talking about. It's yes, absolutely, Stephen Cottrell, we should be praying and voting if we choose to vote, but acting politically for the good of the other. Right, that is true. But he has that, as you sort of imply, entirely wrapped up in this specific system. And anything that takes apart this system and says, no, we need an alternative, a better alternative to move forward with, and perhaps maybe God is in that. To this church, that in and of itself is not of God. And I think that's a problem. Which is not to say there aren't people who, within that church. I mean, I'm Anglican, right? So I'm critiquing these things as an Anglican. So there are very good people who would agree with me rather than agree with the church here. But ultimately, the official line of the church, because going back to what we were talking about before, because it's an established church, because it's literally, that is where the word establishment comes from. It's talking about the relationship of the church to the state. And until we deal with that, until the church refuses to be aligned with power, you're going to see this very milquetoast kind of vote for people who are going to make things easier for other people. Let's not talk about any way of acting beyond that.
But also, let's not even talk about the issues at hand, just in case we offend someone.
That's the thing, is this starts with, the thing at the top of this is the Archbishop's call for respect and kindness in the heat of debate. And it's well, of course they do. They always do. Every time there's an election or anything like that, the very first thing they do is complain that people might be mean. It's this respectability politics that they think is at the heart of the gospel. And I think we would argue has very little to do with the gospel, actually. Jesus said some pretty mean stuff to particular people.
Indeed. And there is also something of using that as a thing to almost guard against, don't be mean to me, but I'll say some pretty horrific things, but I'll say it's not mean, therefore it's not mean. But there's also the other side of trying to keep everything nice. I do think that people who don't act and just allow things to happen, are complacent, are arguably bad people, bad with sort of inverted commas, as it were, because they're still allowing bad things to happen. They may not be doing them directly,
but they're also, this whole idea of respectability and kindness in the heat of debate actually gives legitimacy to things that are unambiguously awful, unambiguously terrible for people that they claim to want to pray for. If you're giving legitimacy to those who say we should put people on a plane and send them to Rwanda, if you're giving legitimacy to people who literally, some of these people want to push boats of asylum seekers back into the sea. Some of them want to shoot them in the sea, right? Let's not mince our words. Some of them want to kill desperate people. If you're giving legitimacy to people who believe that homelessness is something that you choose, who believe in cutting benefits of disabled people, to having a 2-child benefit cap, all of these policies kill people. They kill people. And if you're giving political legitimacy to those people, to those ideas, because you want respect and kindness, that's not just a difference of opinion. That is upholding something that is actively harming people. And I don't have any respect for that.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you need to be intolerant of intolerance.
Yeah.
Yes, let's be respectful of each other, but actually, here's a parameter. We're not going beyond that line because we're not going to dehumanize people. A lot of this episode seems to be us railing against the bullshit of the country we're in currently.
Well, yes, and also the Church of England, but there are some good things to say about this as well. I sort of mentioned before, though, that the Church of England isn't just one voice, one official voice, or even just a couple of voices coming up with this sort of official line. There are differences of opinion, different approaches as well. And one of the interesting ones, I think, is that the Diocese of Salisbury has been accused, apparently, of political electioneering. Now, this is something that always happens, right? The right in particular always have a go at the Church of England whenever anyone in it near election day says anything like, oh, maybe we should be a bit nicer to immigrants, or, think about climate change. And they're like, oh, they're the hard left, they're going to bring communism in, and so on and so forth.
Indeed. They're not being respectful, what we were just talking about, of holding that thing of respect in front of them whilst still blaring horrible things.
I mean, this is the thing. It's amazing how often that whole respectability thing is required of particular people and not others, isn't it? However, the Diocese of Salisbury have produced a 17-page document about the upcoming election, which talks about, apparently, now I am reading from the Tory graph here, so you take it with a pinch of salt, but it tells congregants, apparently, that they are being lied to about the cost of net zero, which is probably true, and that local authorities are not doing enough to provide safe and culturally appropriate sites for traveller communities. This stuff is Tory bait, right?
Yeah. So the climate change one, the power of the fossil fuel lobby is diverting attention from the climate crisis. The fossil fuel energy sector untruthfully promotes the idea that we can't afford to go down the green energy route. Those who speak out about the climate crisis are being silenced or ignored. So that's the climate one. The one about minority groups, all it says about traveller communities, it says lack of access to suitable traveller sites.
Yeah. I mean, which is the most basic. It's the most basic. Like, it's not even a demand, is it? It's just like,
yeah,
this is a fact.
Yeah. I mean, it does say for it to ask what are you doing to encourage local authorities to create safe and culturally appropriate traveller sites?
Which is the law, by the way, right? Like, it is the law that councils in particular, I think county councils actually, but local authorities are legally required to provide safe and culturally appropriate sites for traveller communities. They are, and they have been for decades, right? And they've never done it. They've never done it, right? And it's getting worse in a lot of ways, right? So what this document from the Diocese of Salisbury is calling for is for the law to be upheld. And I don't even care about the law, right? But like, if there's a decent law, great.
But also, that's a really... Again, it's a bit like we were talking about with the Pope. It's a really low bar. When it comes to social justice, following the law is quite a low bar to follow.
Obviously, it's the same kind of people going to hate this, who hate things like squatting, because it's like a fundamentally anti-capitalist form of getting somewhere to live, right? Travelling, it's very hard to operate in a capitalist society and live the lifestyle of a traveller. And squatting, the squatting movement was essentially created as a response to capitalism. It is fundamentally anti-capitalist, right? So it's interesting how there's overlap in these two things, and no wonder the right hate both of them so much.
And actually, I've been looking at the document from Salisbury, Diocese of Salisbury. I'm actually going to share it with my churches. Yeah. It's really quite useful, and it's not specific to that diocese. It's sort of countrywide, and it's not really, really long. It's not really complicated language. It's to the point. It gives people questions to ask the candidates in their area, but also to things to pray for specific issues.
Yeah,
it is such a useful document.
And the thing is, right, it's not especially radical. I would love things to be a lot more radical than they are, but it's a really, these are really considered. It's not to say that radical demands are not considered, but this is a really considered document. The things that it's talking about fall well within the frame of acceptable politics, certainly as we've considered it over the last 20 or 30 years, you're always going to get some gammons who are going to think that even the most milquetoast proposal is communism through the back door. But I think, this is definitely a decent document that you can share with people who perhaps aren't going to go whole hog with you and start calling for revolution. So we'll link that in the show notes. I think that will do us for today. So I think we'll wrap up there.
Yeah.
Jonny, thank you for joining me today. Is there anything else you want to plug or send anyone to apart from this document?
I am getting ordained in a couple of weeks' time, which is very exciting.
Wow.
I know.
Who's ordaining you? This is where we need Lou to come in with their apostolic.
I mean, technically, no one in the Methodist Church is part of the official apostolic succession, so we don't have bishops in the UK anyway.
Well, but I mean, they think of apostolic succession in a different way, don't they? So, you know.
Well, exactly. It's the conference that's our bishop. 300 people, most of whom are lay, which is great.
But do they wear pointy hats?
They don't.
Well, then it's not legit, is it?
It's not real. We're the Methodist Church. We're not proper anyway.
I am talking about wizard hats rather than mitres here as well.
Oh, that'd be great.
And if someone wasn't allowed to get ordained, you'd have someone standing at the front just saying, "You shall not pass," in their wizard hat. I might be kind of overthinking it at this point. So I think we will actually...
But we'd probably get more people coming to church.
I think we're onto something.
You should be in the marketing team for the church.
I was going to say, we should market this, shouldn't we? Anyway, thank you, Jonny, for joining me. You can find this podcast online at breadandrosaries.com. You can follow us on Twitter at bread_rosaries. You can follow us on Facebook at Bread and Rosaries, I think that's right. You can follow me if you wish, most places at Commie XIAN. And I'm going to say thank you very much, and we will see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.